Welcome, Greg. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So data privacy has started to seep into the public consciousness, whether Cambridge Analytica, COVID tracing, or the Twitter hack last week. And I'm excited to learn about GlobaliD and what it is about self-sovereign ID that is so important right now.
Sure. Well, the idea of self-sovereign ID is that you own your identity rather than a particular company or government. And so the particular form of self-sovereign identity we have is built on the concept of a namespace. So your identity is encapsulated into a name, just like you have a handle on Twitter or Skype, and all the attributes of your identity, all the verifications, the proofs are attached to that name, and you ought to be able to take that name anywhere you go and authenticate yourself and get authorization. So instead of having a username for service A and service B, you've got one username that you can use everywhere, and you can prove that you control that username, not with a password. I mean, you could use a password, that's not very secure, but you could have a token of that name on your mobile phone or a card in your pocket. And if you lose that phone or that card or it gets compromised, there's a way that your friends or other people you know could help you reestablish your identity on a new device. So once again, you don't have to depend on a single corporation or a government. So GlobaliD, our organization, is not the control of your name. It's just, and your identity, we're just the protocol that lets you control it yourself. And so at this time of increasing hacks, increasing concerns about surveillance, this is a new sort of way of thinking about identity that puts controls in the hands of the individual.
And can you talk a little bit more about the bottom-up approach and how you're using zero-knowledge proofs?
That's right. So once you get your name, and it doesn't have to be your actual name, think of it as like your handle, you go to various third-party services. You might go we might go through Twilio to confirm that you control your phone number. We might go to an Onfido or a Verif to show that you have taken the information off of a particular government ID, match the picture on that to a picture of your selfie, or through Plaid that you control a particular financial account. And what would show as part of your public record, it's like being in the white pages or the yellow pages, is that you've passed these tests. It doesn't show what your email address is or your phone number or your physical address or your bank account number. It shows that that's been confirmed by a trusted third party. And with those, for instance, you ought to be able to do the classic thing is go to a bar and prove that you're over 18 or over 21 without having to show what your birthday is. And so a zero knowledge proof means that that other relying party can ask a question, can get it answered without you having to give up the actual fine-grained private information about yourself. So it's enough information so you can get permission to act without actually having to share the underlying private information. And so this is enabling and empowering both people, but also developers to include these methods of authentication and authorization into their applications and websites, as opposed to having to build that from scratch and build a silo where your identity once again belongs to them. All these things can be done not just one site at a time, but across any site that participates in this new foundation.
Now, I know that you're working with Uphold, and I'd love to learn more about that partnership. Are you also working with Web3 Foundation or Blockstack?
So we know the Blockstack folks from early on, and so there'll be someone we'll look to do more with down the road. We just picked up Hold as a first use case because they have a kind of a couple million users. They work with Brave, and we thought that's a great way to take something that people are familiar with, a digital wallet. And again, the normal way of doing that, whether you're logging into a traditional Coinbase wallet or a TransferWise wallet, is you'd have a username and password that is associated just with that organization. You might have a second factor of authentication, which might be through like Google Authenticator or Authy, but it still is all built around one company at a time. this experience that we're doing with Uphold, even though we're starting with Uphold first, is portable. So once you get an identity that works with Uphold, you could, in theory, use that again elsewhere. And like a perfect example, another partner we're looking to work with, you'd be able, for instance, to identify yourself on the Brave browser in a privacy-preserving way, so that you could basically have your identity port around with you to like any site that you visited on the web. That site wouldn't actually know who you are, but they would know that the identity visiting that site has been verified, authenticated, is attached to a wallet, and could do things on the web that are powerful, but still in a privacy-preserving way. And so, you start with Uphold, but if you could imagine if anywhere you went on the web that was willing to take self-sovereign credentials, it would be like Amazon, one click, but for everything you could do on the internet. That's the vision, but we have to start somewhere, and Uphold was a great partner to start with.
Great. And that brings up Facebook's Libra or WeChat or Telegram.
Right.
And, how does that compare?
So we look out there in the world, and I would say like it's more likely that identity is going to come from a messaging app than it's going to come from a wallet app. And so I always think of the three clear potential leaders or winners already in this market would be like WeChat from China, Telegram from Europe, and then WhatsApp, which is based out of America but used around the world. Each of them have a messaging stack, a system of identity that could potentially become portable, but it's kind of like going back in time to the days of America Online, Prodigy, and CompuServe. Each of them could have become the internet, but they were each their own proprietary siloed standard. And AOL couldn't get CompuServe to do everything with AOL's protocol. They each had their own, and they basically just battled it out. It was the battle of the elephants. But then a protocol approach came along, which was the World Wide Web and the domain name system. And originally, the web was less powerful than any of those siloed services. But because it was an open protocol and it wasn't proprietary, that open protocol won out. And so that's the big question: is somebody like it's kind of like the Highlander, one sword to rule them all? Is WeChat going to vanquish Telegram and WhatsApp and become the standard of the world, or vice versa? And, our observation of history is none of those folks are going to be able to like dominate over the rest. So unless there's an open protocol solution, each of those they have a big head start, just like AOL and CompuServe. But we're betting on the protocol approach, that a version of identity that's interoperable across the silos would be the only way that there could be a universal solution. But it's absolutely true that each of those firms, because of their size, their user base, their technological clout, can easily push their identity system, just like Facebook Connect is pushed it's a proprietary closed system, but my gosh, it reaches 2 billion people. And so that's the battle. We saw how it worked out in the 1990s. The World Wide Web came to be. Our supposition is that there could be, just like there's a domain name system, there could be an identity name system that is interoperable across all of those platform customer bases.
And Europe has been very proactive. In fact, last week there was a surprise ruling on US cloud services, and they've been more proactive with GDPR and privacy in general. What's your view on Europe?
So the Europeans are interesting because they actually view privacy as a human right, whereas in the United States, privacy is treated as a contract right, which you tend to sign away as soon as you sign one of those 50-page terms of use. And so they're way ahead in terms of thinking of privacy in a very human rights fundamental way. The problem is also Europe is quite bureaucratic, and so the construct behind GDPR is you give people fine-grained control of who they share their data with. But as you've seen, it's quite complicated having all these bilateral data sharing arrangements, which you then can revoke. So once you've shared your data, in theory under GDPR, you can revoke that sharing. But I don't think without a time machine that you can really go back and kind of unshare once you've shared something. Yes, you can ask someone to destroy it, but once the cat's out of the bag, it's a very difficult construct. This construct of the right to be forgotten is a nice construct, but I come from the Twitter world, and once you tweeted something, yes, you can untweet it, but once the public has seen it, it really is out there. And so the problem with GDPR is you still have all this private information moving around. The more efficient, more truly privacy preserving method, in our opinion, is to go to zero knowledge proofs and not share the data at all. Just share knowledge about the data and keep the data locked down, encrypted, in control of the people.
Speaking of Twitter, you're a longstanding investor, and Jack Dorsey's made his Bitcoin interest clear. Given the events of last week with the hack, are you having conversations with him about that?
Well, I haven't talked to Jack about it. Twitter still is it's been 15 years now. It's like a 15-year-old construct, and so Twitter still, like most legacy offerings, has this concept that your identity in Twitter is still like a user handle attached essentially to a phone number, and it's kind of the oldest trick in the book. If you do a SIM swap, and you can convince a rep at a Verizon or AT&T store that you lost your phone and you need a new one, and you're the person who's associated with that Twitter account, well, you're going to get, through a password reset, control of that Twitter account. And if one of those people that you do that for is an employee at Twitter who has access to like account control for key people, this is going to continue to happen. So as long as identity is still attached to something that is your phone number or your email address, that's a big attack vector. And until you move to a concept of identity where those are indicators, but that's not actually your identity, you're going to continue to have these kinds of compromises.
Well, given your experience as a highly experienced financial risk officer, what are your thoughts on the recent blacklisting of stablecoin addresses?
Well, once again, I mean, you can blacklist an address. It's kind of like what's behind that address and who controls that address. And so, that's kind of a one step removed type solution. When I came to Ripple early on, I think I was the 10th person at Ripple as the chief risk officer, and which included compliance. We only had, there were like maybe 100,000 accounts or addresses out there. And early on, we could have at that time said, well, we ought to have identity associated with those addresses. But that was not the blockchain way. So you end up with this huge group of addresses, and you have essentially some idea, but maybe no idea about a lot of those. And it's always been a question. In the blockchain world, one of the key compliance issues is it's not for sending money. You could receive money from any other address. As long as they know your address, they can push money into your address. And that organization might be a terrorist organization, it might be a criminal organization. And you might say, well, why would they send you money? Well, once you start receiving money from a bad address, you look like a bad person.
Right.
It's really easy to set someone up to look like they're the recipient of a bribe or are involved in some nefarious activity. And so as long as you only have a system of public key, private key pairs, it's like a bearer bond system. Anybody who has the routing information can make things happen. And with no information behind who they are or why they're sending the money, it's very difficult to understand how that solution at scale could ever be compliant and not problematic. Blacklisting is better than nothing, but it really, if you think you're really going to be effective with that strategy and that's your primary method, there's some very unpleasant things that are going to happen.
And your thoughts on the DeFi hype the past few months?
Well, I mean, DeFi it's just, I mean, it sounds great. We just need to see what is going to be that killer DeFi app that really makes that like a household kind of phenomenon. And so I'm still sort of waiting and looking to see like what gets pushed over the threshold. So there's still, in my mind, a gap between the hype and having arrived. So
yeah, it's like a house of whales. Everybody's trading with each other in the same circle.
Yeah.
And
So
then
I'm looking for that, like at Square, it was the food trucks when we could like service 70 food trucks in San Francisco. It kind of like, wow, this really could move the dial. And so I'm looking for that situation where it confirms that reality is going to, matter to people in everyday life.
Right. Well, it will be interesting to watch, and we so appreciate you joining us today, Greg, and look forward to having you back.
All right. Thanks for your time today. Take care.